As we look at the responsibility of students for constructing their own learning and the student-to-student interaction, we can't overlook the work of John Dewey. And John Dewey was one of the first theorists that started looking at student-centered learning. And this was a big change from what was happening in those days with only teacher-centered learning. So let me give you a little bit more information about John Dewey. Dr. Dewey was one of the very first people who ever thought that experience was important in learning. He wanted students to learn not only from the instructor, but also from the world around them. Can you imagine that? In those days, in the late 1800s, John Dewey was saying that the students need to look outside the classroom and experience the world around them. In John Dewey's experiential learning theory, everything occurs in a social learning environment. Knowledge is socially constructed and based on experiences. Many people couldn't understand this theory. Where was the teacher in this whole scenario? John Dewey said that this knowledge should be organized in real-life experiences that provide a context for information. Well, as people were asking, where's the teacher in John Dewey's theory? He said it was the teacher's role to organize the content and to facilitate the actual learning experience. And is that not what we do today in online education? Aren't the instructors the ones who are the facilitators, the guides, and the mentors? Well, this is exactly what John Dewey was talking about. The quality of experience is the primary component of John Dewey's theory. Upon completion of the experience, he said, students have the knowledge and the ability to apply that knowledge to different scenarios. So he said you weren't just learning to be able to go take a test or write a paper. John Dewey said if you experienced the learning, then you will have it internalized and you'll be able to apply it to different settings and different scenarios. You created new knowledge at a different level and you have applied it to your past knowledge. And that's really what John Dewey was trying to say about education in those days and education in the future. Dewey argued that education and learning are social and interactive processes. We know that, and much more research has been done on those exact topics. Dewey made a strong case for the importance of education not only as a place to gain content knowledge, but also a place to learn how to live. Isn't that interesting? He was saying that knowledge is helping us to become better digital citizens. And he probably had no idea that digital education was going to be coming in the future. In his eyes, the purpose of education should not revolve around the acquisition of a predetermined set of skills, but rather the realization of one's potential and the ability to use those skills for the greater good of society. In addition to helping students realize their full potential, Dewey goes on to acknowledge that education and schooling are instrumental in creating social change and reform. Dewey saw education as changing the democracy, as changing the society, as helping to educate the population to better serve the country. And so I just want to take a minute here in this lecture and tell you a little bit about an experience I had with this exact scenario. When I was invited by the South African government to come there and help institute online learning at 5 major universities, it was exciting and it was also a bit scary. Um, but what was happening was the government of South Africa realized that much of their population, probably 60%, was uneducated. If they could not change that, then there was no way that South Africa was going to grow in the world economy. The problem was, and still is today, that many people in parts of South Africa live without running water, they live without television, and they certainly live without internet. So the government had to have a progression of steps, and that was part of my role, was to decide how do they get the infrastructure into the people. And then how do they train the educators to teach with this new media called online? And so what they were seeing is that the only way to change their economic level was through education. And if you apply that to what John Dewey said, you can see the exact correlation. You've heard me use the term constructivism in the lectures in this course, and John Dewey was really one of the first ones to use that term. He was concerned with the learner, and he wanted to shed some light on the learner as the important agent in the learning process. He had precise insights regarding education and how it should take place in the classroom. But John Dewey wanted the student to have a voice in that education. He wanted them to be able to bring their prior knowledge and to bring their questions to the learning environment. No one had ever done that before. John Dewey presented 2 major conflicting schools of thought about education, and this really turned the education world of those days upside down. First of all, John Dewey said that first the education has to be centered on the curriculum and focuses mainly on the subject matter being taught. That's what he saw. He said that the education of that day when he was creating his theory and doing his research is that the education was centered on the curriculum and on the content. But he argued that this was a weakness. He said this made students passive learners. They simply sat in a classroom and listened. They had no way to interact. Of course, they could ask a question, but the education was mainly delivered by the instructor, and it was passively received. Then he went on to argue that in order for education to be most effective, the content has to be approached in a way that allows the student to relate the new knowledge to prior experiences. And he said that deepened the connection between the new knowledge coming in and what we already knew. Well, you can imagine his theories were very, very controversial, but we see them being applied in today's education. Dewey looked at the student and the curriculum as 2 sides of learning, 2 sides that really have to interact with each other. One cannot do without the other. These ideas made Dewey one of the most famous advocates of student-centered learning, and we see that in online education today.